The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty military compound as Sarah Mitchell stepped out of the transport vehicle, her heart racing with anticipation. After 8 months of separation, she was finally going to see her husband again. The wedding ring on her finger caught the light as she adjusted her simple civilian clothes, trying to look presentable after the long journey to this remote base in Afghanistan. What Sarah didn't know was that in exactly 37 minutes, the peaceful family reunion she had dreamed about would transform into a nightmare that would test every skill she had learned during her years as a military sniper before she became a wife and mother. The Taliban forces gathering in the mountains beyond the base perimeter had been watching, waiting, and planning their most audacious attack yet. As Sarah walked toward the barracks where her husband David was stationed, she had no idea that the rifle training that had once defined her military career would soon be the only thing standing between life and death for everyone on that base. The quiet woman who had traded her combat boots for a peaceful life was about to become the most important person in a battle that would make international headlines. This is the story of how one woman's unexpected visit became a legendary tale of courage, love, and survival against impossible odds. Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the heavy metal door of the barracks. The journey to reach this remote military outpost in the mountains of Afghanistan had taken 3 days of coordinated travel through military checkpoints, armored convoys, and, finally, a helicopter ride that had left her stomach churning. But none of that mattered now. After 8 long months of video calls, delayed messages, and sleepless nights worrying about her husband's safety, she was finally here. The base, known as Forward Operating Base Granite, sat nestled in a valley surrounded by towering mountains that seemed to scrape the sky. It was a small installation, housing fewer than 200 soldiers, but it served as a crucial supply and communication hub for operations in the region. Sarah had studied every detail about this place during her weeks of preparation for the visit, wanting to understand the world where her husband David spent his days. As she pushed open the barracks door, the familiar smell of military life hit her immediately. That unique combination of cleaning supplies, worn leather, and the metallic tang of equipment that she remembered from her own service years. For a moment, she was transported back to her days as Sergeant Sarah Coleman, one of the most skilled snipers in her unit. But those days felt like another lifetime now. David looked up from his bunk where he was cleaning his rifle, and his face lit up with a smile that could have powered the entire base. In 3 quick strides, he crossed the room and swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around like they were teenagers again. "I can't believe you're actually here," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "When it told me the visit was approved, I thought I was dreaming." Sarah laughed, a sound that had been missing from her life for far too long. "I had to pull a lot of strings and fill out more paperwork than when I enlisted," she said, pulling back to look at his face. He looked older, she noticed. The stress lines around his eyes were deeper, and there was a weariness in his expression that hadn't been there when he left. But his smile was the same smile that had made her fall in love with him 10 years ago. "How's Emma?" David asked immediately, referring to their 8-year-old daughter who was staying with Sarah's sister back in Colorado. "She made you this," Sarah said, reaching into her bag and pulling out a carefully folded piece of construction paper. When David opened it, he found a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. At the bottom, in Emma's careful handwriting, were the words, "Come home soon, Daddy. We love you." David's eyes misted over as he stared at the drawing. "I've missed so much," he said quietly. "You'll make up for it when you come home," Sarah assured him, taking his hand. "Only 4 more months." The next few hours passed like a beautiful dream. David showed her around the base, introducing her to his fellow soldiers with obvious pride. Many of them had heard stories about David's wife, the former sniper who could outshoot half the men in the army, but Sarah was surprised by how warmly they welcomed her. These men had become David's family away from home, and she could see the bonds of brotherhood that had formed between them. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, David's closest friend on the base, joined them for lunch in the mess hall. "Your husband talks about you constantly," he told Sarah with a grin. "We know everything about your first date, your wedding, the time you beat him at the shooting range during basic training." "She didn't just beat me," David laughed. "She destroyed me. I scored 87 out of 100. She scored a perfect 100 without breaking a sweat." "Lucky shot," Sarah said modestly, but Rodriguez wasn't buying it. "I've seen your service record," he said. "Lucky doesn't account for 3 years of perfect scores and 2 commendations for marksmanship." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the praise. Those days seemed so far away now. After leaving the military, she had deliberately distanced herself from that part of her life. She wanted to be a mother, a wife, a normal civilian. The rifle skills that had once defined her identity were something she preferred to forget. As the afternoon wore on, David took her to see his workspace in the communications center. The base was responsible for coordinating supply drops and maintaining contact with several smaller outposts scattered throughout the region. It was demanding work that required constant vigilance, as the mountains were known to be filled with hostile forces who regularly attempted to disrupt military operations. "It's not the most exciting assignment," David admitted as he showed her the radio equipment and computer systems he worked with daily. "But it's important work, and it's relatively safe compared to some of the other positions I could have gotten." "I'm grateful for that," Sarah said, meaning it. When David had first been deployed, she had imagined him in constant firefights, dodging bullets and explosions. The reality of his job, while still dangerous, was somewhat reassuring. As evening approached, they found themselves sitting on a concrete barrier outside the communications building, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The view was breathtaking, with the peaks turning various shades of purple and gold as the light faded. For a moment, it was easy to forget they were in a war zone. "I've been thinking about what I want to do when I get back," David said, his arm around Sarah's shoulders. "Rodriguez has been talking about opening a security consulting business. He thinks my communications experience would be valuable." "That sounds promising," Sarah replied, though privately she hoped David would consider something completely removed from military life. She wanted their family to have a fresh start, away from anything that reminded them of deployments and danger. "What about you?" David asked. "Have you given any more thought to going back to school?" Sarah had been considering a nursing program at the community college near their home. It would be a way to start a new career that focused on helping people heal rather than the destructive skills she had learned in the Army. "I think I will," she said. "Emma's old enough now that she doesn't need me constantly, and I think I'd be good at it." As they talked about their future plans, neither of them noticed the movement in the mountains beyond the base perimeter. High above them, concealed among the rocks and scrub brush, enemy scouts were conducting their final reconnaissance of the base layout. They had been planning this attack for weeks, waiting for the right moment when supplies would be low and reinforcements would be far away. The base's evening routine proceeded normally around them. Soldiers finished their duties, grabbed dinner, and settled in for another quiet night in the mountains. The guard towers were manned according to standard protocol, but the overall atmosphere was relaxed. Attacks on forward operating base Granite were rare, and the base had gone nearly 6 months without any significant hostile contact. Sarah and David made their way to the small guest quarters where Sarah would be staying during her 3-day visit. It was a simple room with a narrow bed, a metal desk, and a small window that looked out over the motor pool. Not luxurious, but it felt like paradise to Sarah because it meant she could be close to her husband. "I still can't believe the Army approved this," David said as they stood in the doorway of her temporary room. "Civilian visits to forward bases are almost unheard of. I think your commanding officer felt sorry for us after all the delays and extensions to your deployment," Sarah replied. "Plus, I may have mentioned that I was former military myself." "That probably didn't hurt," David agreed. "Colonel Harrison served with some snipers in Iraq. He has a lot of respect for the specialty." As the base settled into evening quiet, Sarah unpacked her small bag and arranged her few belongings in the room. She had packed light, bringing only the essentials for her 3-day stay. Among her clothes, she had tucked away a small photo album filled with pictures of Emma from the past 8 months, updates on all the milestones David had missed. They spent the evening looking through the photos, with Sarah providing commentary on each image. Emma losing her first tooth, Emma's soccer game where she scored the winning goal, Emma's school play where she played a tree with tremendous enthusiasm. David absorbed every detail, trying to fill in the gaps in his memory of his daughter's life. "She's grown so much," he said, studying a recent school photo. "She looks more like you every day." "She has your stubbornness," Sarah laughed. "Last week she spent 2 hours arguing with me about why she should be allowed to have ice cream for breakfast." Did she win? Almost. She made some very compelling points about calcium and the nutritional value of dairy products. As the night deepened, they reluctantly said goodnight. Military protocol meant that David had to return to his own quarters, and Sarah would spend the night alone in the guest room. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being thousands of miles apart. Sarah lay in the narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the military base at night. Guard shifts changing, the distant hum of generators, the occasional vehicle moving through the compound. It was so different from the quiet suburban neighborhood where she and Emma lived, but somehow comforting because she knew David was nearby. She must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing she knew, she was being jolted awake by a sound that sent ice through her veins. The sharp crack of rifle fire, followed immediately by the whistle of incoming mortars. Sarah sat up in bed, instantly alert, her old training kicking in despite years of civilian life. The sound was coming from the perimeter of the base, and it was getting closer. This wasn't a drill or a false alarm. Forward operating base Granite was under attack. In the distance, she could hear soldiers shouting orders, boots running on concrete, and the metallic sounds of weapons being readied for combat. Emergency lights began flashing outside her window, casting eerie red shadows across the walls of her room. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. She was a civilian now, a visitor with no official role in the base's defense. Her job was to stay safe, stay out of the way, and let the trained soldiers handle the situation. But as the sound of gunfire intensified and she heard the unmistakable whistle of more incoming mortars, she realized that this was not going to be a brief skirmish that would be resolved quickly. Whatever was happening outside, it was big, it was serious, and it was just getting started. The explosion that rocked the base at 3:47 a.m. shattered more than just the peaceful mountain silence. It shattered any illusion that this would be another quiet night at Forward Operating Base Granite. Sarah felt the concussion wave through the walls of her quarters as plaster dust rained down from the ceiling. The emergency alarm system began its urgent wailing, a sound that brought back memories she had tried hard to bury. Sarah threw on her clothes with practiced efficiency, her hands moving automatically despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Years of military training had ingrained certain responses so deeply that they survived even after she had traded her uniform for civilian life. As she laced up her boots, she could hear the chaos erupting outside. Shouted commands, running footsteps, the mechanical sounds of heavy weapons being positioned and loaded. Through her small window, she could see muzzle flashes lighting up the mountains beyond the base perimeter like deadly fireflies. The attackers had positioned themselves strategically, taking advantage of the high ground and the cover of darkness. This wasn't a random raid or a probe of the base's defenses. This was a coordinated assault by a large, well-organized force. Sarah cracked open her door and peered into the corridor. Soldiers were running past, carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and communications equipment. The organized chaos of a military unit responding to contact was something she remembered well, but seeing it from the perspective of a civilian visitor felt surreal and frightening. "Ma'am, you need to get to the safe room immediately," called out a young private who spotted her in the doorway. "All non-essential personnel are to report to Building C, basement level." Sarah nodded and was about to follow his directions when another massive explosion shook the base. This one was closer, much closer. Through the emergency lighting, she could see smoke and flames rising for what looked like the motor pool area. The attackers weren't just firing randomly. They were systematically targeting key infrastructure. As she made her way toward Building C, Sarah passed the communications center where David worked. Her heart raced as she wondered if he was safe, if he was somewhere in this chaos, trying to coordinate the base's response. The urge to find him was overwhelming, but she knew that searching for him would only put both of them in more danger. The safe room in Building C's basement was already crowded with civilian contractors, off-duty personnel, and support staff. The room had been designed as a shelter during attacks, with reinforced concrete walls and emergency supplies. But as Sarah descended the stairs, she could see fear in the faces of the 24 people already gathered there. "What's the situation up there?" asked Dr. Rebecca Chun, the base's chief medical officer, who was among those taking shelter. "It's bad," replied Master Sergeant Williams, the senior enlisted man responsible for the safe room. "Early reports suggest we're facing a coordinated attack by at least 50 insurgents. They got mortars, RPGs, and what sounds like some heavy machine guns positioned in the mountains. 50 insurgents against a base of fewer than 200 soldiers might not sound like overwhelming odds, but Sarah knew the attackers had significant advantages. They had chosen the time and place of the battle, they held the high ground, and they had clearly spent considerable time planning this assault. The defenders, caught by surprise in the middle of the night, were at a severe disadvantage. "Are reinforcements coming?" asked one of the civilian contractors, a man named Peterson who worked on the base's computer systems. "Colonel Harrison has already called for support," Williams replied, "but the nearest reinforcements are at least 6 hours away by helicopter, assuming the weather holds. We're going to have to handle this ourselves." 6 hours. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the reality of their situation sank in. The base would have to survive a sustained attack by a well-armed enemy force for 6 hours with no outside help. She had been in combat situations before, but always as part of a larger military operation with multiple layers of support available. This was different. This was survival. As if to emphasize the point, another series of explosions rocked the base above them. The lights in the safe room flickered, and dust fell from the ceiling. Through the thick concrete, they could hear the distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire getting closer to their building. "They're trying to breach the perimeter," Williams said grimly, speaking into his radio. "Roger that, Command." "Understood." He turned back to the group in the safe room. "The enemy has successfully breached the outer fence line on the north side of the base. Our people are falling back to secondary defensive positions." Sarah's mind automatically began processing tactical information. The north side of the base was where the communications center was located, which meant David's position was now in immediate danger. She closed her eyes and tried to push down the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. Worrying about David wouldn't help him, and it wouldn't help anyone else in this situation. "Sergeant Williams," she found herself saying, "what's our defensive situation? How many people do we have actively fighting?" Williams looked at her with surprise. Most civilians didn't ask tactical questions during a crisis. "Are you military, ma'am?" "Former military," Sarah replied. "Sergeant Sarah Coleman, former sniper specialist, 3 tours overseas." Williams' demeanor changed immediately. In the military, a sniper's credentials commanded instant respect. "We've got about 130 soldiers available for defense," he said. "The rest are either on patrol outside the base or temporarily assigned to other locations. We've got good defensive positions, but we're spread thin across the perimeter." Sarah nodded, her tactical mind automatically assessing the situation. 130 defenders against 50 attackers should have been manageable, except for the terrain disadvantage and the fact that the attackers had clearly planned this assault carefully. The enemy would have studied the base's layout, identified weak points, and chosen their approach routes accordingly. Another explosion, this one close enough to make everyone in the safe room flinch, was followed by the sound of sustained gunfire. Through the walls, they could hear soldiers shouting orders and calling for ammunition. The battle was intensifying, and from the sound of it, the defenders were being pushed back. "Ma'am," Williams said to Sarah, "I know you're a civilian now, but if things get desperate up there, we might need every person with combat experience." "Understand," Sarah replied, though the thought of picking up a weapon again made her stomach churn. She had left that life behind for good reasons. The skills that had made her an effective sniper had also left her with nightmares and a constant hypervigilance that had taken years to overcome. Emma needed a mother, not a soldier. But Emma also needed her mother to come home alive. The radio chatter that Williams was monitoring painted an increasingly grim picture. The attackers had breached the perimeter in 2 locations and were advancing on key buildings. The base's ammunition storage was under threat, and there were reports of casualties in the communications center. The communications center. David. Sarah felt her resolve hardening. She might be a civilian now, but she wasn't helpless. And if David was in danger, she couldn't just sit in this basement waiting to see what happened. Sergeant Williams, she said quietly, I need to know about weapons availability. Williams studied her face for a long moment. He had seen enough combat to recognize the look of someone making a difficult decision. There's an armory on this level, he said finally. Emergency weapons cache for situations exactly like this one. As the sounds of battle raged above them, Sarah found herself walking toward a choice she had never wanted to make again. Behind her, Dr. Chun was organizing the medical supplies in case wounded soldiers needed treatment. Peterson and the other civilians were huddled together, trying to stay calm in an increasingly desperate situation. The armory was a small room lined with racks of rifles, ammunition, and other military equipment. Sarah's hands moved automatically as she examined the available weapons. Muscle memory taking over despite years of trying to forget these skills. She selected an M24 sniper rifle, a weapon system she knew intimately from her years of service. As she loaded the rifle and gathered ammunition, Williams appeared in the armory doorway. You don't have to do this, he said. You're a civilian. No one expects you to fight. My husband is up there, Sarah replied simply. And even if he wasn't, these are good people who don't deserve to die because some terrorist decided to attack a military base. Williams nodded slowly. Where do you want to position yourself? Sarah considered the base layout she had observed during her tour the previous day. The water tower, she said. It's got clear sight lines to the northern approach routes, and it's far enough from the main battle to avoid getting overrun. That tower's not designed for combat, Williams warned. No cover, no easy escape route. I don't need cover, Sarah said, checking the scope on her rifle. I just need a clear shot. As they prepared to leave the safe room, another massive explosion shook the building. This one was different, though. Instead of the sharp crack of a mortar round, this was the deep, rolling thunder of something much larger. Through the chaos on Williams' radio, they heard fragmentary reports that made Sarah's blood run cold. The attackers had brought explosives powerful enough to breach the base's main defensive walls. What had started as a coordinated assault was turning into a potential massacre. The odds were shifting decisively in favor of the attackers, and time was running out for everyone at Forward Operating Base Granite. Sarah shouldered her rifle and checked her ammunition one final time. In a few minutes, she would climb that water tower and take aim at human targets for the first time in over 5 years. She had sworn she would never do this again, had promised herself that part of her life was over forever. But sometimes the choices that defined a person weren't the ones they wanted to make. Sometimes they were simply the ones they couldn't avoid. The journey from the basement's safe room to the water tower felt like walking through a war zone, which, Sarah realized grimly, was exactly what it was. Emergency lighting cast everything in harsh red shadows as she and Sergeant Williams made their way across the base compound. The sounds of combat were much louder now that they were outside, with the crack of rifle fire, the distinctive chatter of machine guns, and the occasional boom of mortar rounds creating a deadly symphony in the mountain air. Stay low and move fast, Williams instructed as they prepared to cross an open area between buildings. The tower's about 200 meters from here, but will be exposed for most of that distance. Sarah nodded, adjusting her grip on the M24 rifle. The weight of the weapon felt familiar in her hands, like greeting an old friend she wasn't sure she was happy to see. Her muscle memory had kicked in completely now, years of civilian life falling away as her military training reasserted itself. The transformation was unsettling, but undeniable. They sprinted across the open ground in a zigzag pattern, using whatever cover they could find. Abandoned vehicles, supply containers, and concrete barriers provided brief moments of protection as they made their way toward the water tower. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from the mountains around the base, indicating that the attackers had positioned themselves in a rough semicircle around the northern and eastern approaches. There, Williams pointed toward a cluster of buildings near the communications center. That's where your husband's unit is positioned. They're holding the line, but they're taking heavy fire. Sarah's heart clenched as she saw tracer rounds streaking through the air around the communications building. David was somewhere in that chaos, probably helping coordinate the base's defensive response while dodging bullets and explosions. The urge to run to him was overwhelming, but she forced herself to focus on the mission. The best way to help David was to get into position where she could provide effective fire support. The water tower loomed above them, a metal structure about 40 feet high that provided the base with water pressure and storage. It hadn't been designed as a fighting position, which meant it lacked the protective features that would normally be found in a military observation post. But it also meant the attackers wouldn't expect anyone to use it for defensive purposes. "The ladder's on the far side," Williams said, leading her around the base of the tower. "Once you're up there, you'll have a commanding view of the entire northern approach. But remember, you'll also be visible to anyone with night vision equipment." "Understood," Sarah replied. In her sniper training, she had learned that the best fighting positions were often the most dangerous ones. Height advantage and clear sight lines came with the cost of exposure and vulnerability. As they reached the base of the ladder, Williams grabbed her arm. "One more thing," he said seriously. "If this position gets overrun, if you see enemy forces heading for this tower, you need to abandon it immediately. Don't try to be a hero." "I'm not trying to be a hero," Sarah said. "I'm trying to keep my husband alive." Williams studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Good luck, Sergeant." The climb up the water tower ladder was one of the longest 40 feet of Sarah's life. Each rung took her higher into the air, making her more visible to anyone watching from the mountains. The metal rungs were cold and slippery with moisture from the mountain air, and the rifle slung across her back made the climb awkward. But finally, she reached the narrow platform that surrounded the water tank at the top. The view from the platform was both breathtaking and terrifying. She could see the entire base spread out below her, with the defensive positions clearly visible as clusters of muzzle flashes in the darkness. Beyond the base perimeter, she could make out the positions of the attacking force, marked by the bright flashes of their weapons as they fired down from the mountainsides. Sarah quickly assessed the tactical situation. The attackers had indeed positioned themselves in a semicircle around the base, with their heaviest concentrations on the northern and eastern sides. They were using classic infantry tactics, applying pressure at multiple points while keeping their main force concentrated for a decisive breakthrough. It was a textbook assault, which meant their leadership had significant military training. She set up her shooting position on the northern side of the platform, using the water tank itself as partial cover while maintaining clear sight lines to the enemy positions. The M24 rifle felt steady and familiar as she settled into a prone shooting position, adjusting the scope and checking her ammunition supply one more time. Through the scope, the battlefield came into sharp focus. She could see individual enemy fighters moving among the rocks and scrub brush on the mountainside, their heat signatures visible through the night vision equipment mounted on her rifle. They were approximately 400 to 600 meters away, well within the effective range of her weapon system. Sarah's first target was a man operating what appeared to be a mortar tube from a concealed position about 500 meters to the northeast. He was in the process of loading another round when she acquired him in her crosshairs. For a moment, time seemed suspended as all her old instincts and training crystallized into this single moment of decision. She squeezed the trigger with the smooth, controlled motion that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of practice. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and through the scope, she saw the target fall. The mortar position went silent. Target eliminated, she whispered to herself, using the clinical language of military operations to distance herself from the reality of what she had just done. But there was no time for reflection or moral wrestling. The battle was raging below, and she could see American soldiers falling back under intense pressure. Her second target was a machine gun team that had set up on an outcropping about 400 meters to the north. The gunner was laying down suppressive fire on the communications building, keeping the defenders pinned down while other attackers maneuvered for a better position. Sarah adjusted her aim, compensating for wind and distance, and fired again. The machine gun fell silent. From her elevated position, Sarah could see the immediate tactical impact of her intervention. The loss of the mortar and machine gun positions had disrupted the attackers' fire support, allowing the defenders near the communications building to reposition and return effective fire. She could see soldiers moving between defensive positions, no longer pinned down by the concentrated enemy fire. But the attackers were adapting quickly. She watched through her scope as several enemy fighters began moving toward new positions, trying to reestablish their fire superiority. Some of them were looking up toward the water tower, apparently having figured out where the sniper fire was coming from. Sarah's third shot took out the leader of a group that was attempting to flank the communications building from the east. Her fourth eliminated a sniper who had been engaging targets from a hidden position in the rocks. With each shot, she felt herself slipping deeper into the mindset that had made her such an effective soldier years ago. The clinical precision, the emotional detachment, the ability to reduce human beings to tactical problems that needed to be solved. It was exactly the mindset she had worked so hard to leave behind when she became a civilian. But in this moment, with David's life and the lives of everyone on the base hanging in the balance, she embraced it completely. Below her, the tide of the battle was beginning to shift. The loss of key enemy positions had allowed the base's defenders to reorganize and establish more effective defensive lines. She could hear Colonel Harrison's voice on the radio communications, coordinating the response and deploying his limited resources more effectively. But the attackers weren't giving up. If anything, they seemed to be increasing the intensity of their assault. More mortar rounds began falling on the base, and Sarah could see additional enemy fighters moving down from higher elevations in the mountains. The initial force of 50 that Sergeant Williams had mentioned was apparently just the first wave. Through her scope, Sarah identified what appeared to be a command post about 700 meters away, partially concealed behind a cluster of large rocks. She could see several figures gathered around what looked like radio equipment, with one person who seemed to be directing the movements of other fighters. Taking out the command element could seriously disrupt the attacker's coordination. But 700 meters was at the extreme range of her weapon system, and the target was partially concealed. The shot would require perfect conditions and flawless execution. Miss, and she would reveal her position to an enemy force that was already starting to focus their attention on the water tower. Sarah took a deep breath and settled into her shooting position. Through the scope, she could see the target clearly enough to make the shot, but just barely. Wind conditions were relatively calm, which was good, but the range meant that even a small error in calculation would result in a miss. She was lining up the shot when a burst of automatic weapons fire struck the water tower just below her position, sending sparks and metal fragments flying through the air. Someone down there had definitely figured out where she was shooting from, and they were starting to return fire. More bullets struck the tower, some of them close enough that she could feel the vibration through the metal platform. The attackers were trying to suppress her position, to keep her from taking the shot that could disrupt their command structure. It was now or never. Sarah ignored the incoming fire, focused completely on the distant target, and squeezed the trigger. Through the scope, she saw the figure at the command post drop. Almost immediately, the coordination of the enemy assault began to break down as subordinate leaders lost contact with their commander. But her position was now completely compromised. Enemy fire was converging on the water tower from multiple directions, and She could see several groups of attackers beginning to move in her direction. It was time to relocate before the position became untenable. As she gathered her equipment and prepared to climb down from the tower, Sarah realized that in the space of 20 minutes, she had completely re-entered the world she had tried so hard to leave behind. The woman who had climbed this tower was Emma's mother, David's wife, a nursing student planning a quiet civilian life. The woman preparing to climb down was a combat veteran who had just changed the course of a battle. And the night was far from over. The climb down from the water tower was far more harrowing than the ascent had been. Bullets were now flying in Sarah's direction from multiple positions, some of them striking the metal ladder rungs just inches from her hands. The attackers had clearly identified her as a priority target, and they were dedicating significant resources to eliminating her position. Sarah moved as quickly as she dared, trying to balance speed with the need to maintain her grip on the ladder while carrying her rifle. The metal rungs were now slick with moisture and her own perspiration, making each step treacherous. About halfway down, a burst of automatic weapons fire struck the ladder directly above her head, sending metal fragments and sparks cascading around her. When she finally reached the ground, Sergeant Williams was waiting for her in the cover of a concrete utility building. His face was grim as he helped her take cover from the incoming fire. "That was some impressive shooting up there," he said. "You disrupted their entire assault pattern. But they know where you are now, and they're sending people to hunt you down." Sarah could see what he meant. Through the emergency lighting, she spotted at least 2 groups of enemy fighters moving across the base perimeter, heading in their direction. The attackers were no longer content to simply assault the base from a distance. They were bringing the fight inside the wire. "We need to move," Sarah said, checking her ammunition. She had used 5 rounds from her initial supply, leaving her with enough for perhaps a dozen more shots before she would need to find additional supplies. "Where can we reposition?" "The motor pool," Williams replied. "It's got good cover and multiple escape routes. Plus, there's an ammunition cache there if you need to resupply." They moved quickly across the base, using buildings and equipment for cover as they made their way toward the motor pool. The sounds of combat were now coming from multiple directions, indicating that the battle had evolved from a perimeter defense into a series of smaller firefights scattered across the base. As they ran, Sarah caught glimpses of the larger tactical situation. American soldiers were fighting from defensive positions around key buildings, but the attackers had succeeded in penetrating the base perimeter in several locations. This was no longer a siege. It was urban combat, with all the chaos and unpredictability that entailed. The motor pool was a large open area filled with military vehicles, supply containers, and maintenance equipment. It provided excellent cover for a sniper position, with clear sight lines to several approach routes that the attackers were likely to use. Sarah quickly identified a position behind an armored transport vehicle that would give her both protection and a good field of fire. "I can see the communications building from here," she said, setting up her rifle on the hood of the vehicle. Through her scope, she could make out the defensive positions around the building where David was stationed. The situation there looked desperate, with enemy forces closing in from 2 directions while the defenders were running low on ammunition. "Sarah," the voice calling her name made her look up from her scope in surprise. Sprinting toward their position across the motor pool was Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, David's closest friend on the base. His uniform was torn and bloody, and he was limping heavily on his left leg. "Rodriguez, what's your status?" Williams called out as the wounded soldier reached their position. "The communications building is about to be overrun," Rodriguez gasped, dropping down behind the vehicle with them. "We've got wounded men who can't be moved, and we're almost out of ammunition. The colonel ordered us to fall back, but David refused to leave his post. He's still trying to maintain radio contact with the incoming reinforcements." Sarah felt her heart stop. David was still in the communications building, still at his post, while enemy forces closed in around him. The professional soldier in her understood his decision. Maintaining communications with reinforcements was crucial to the survival of everyone on the base. The wife and mother in her wanted to scream, "How many enemy fighters are moving on the communications building?" she asked, forcing herself to think tactically. "At least a dozen, maybe more," Rodriguez replied. "They're coming from the north and east, using the damaged sections of the perimeter fence as entry points. We held them off as long as we could, but we just don't have enough people." Sarah looked through her scope toward the communications building. She could see the enemy fighters Rodriguez was talking about, groups of armed men moving systematically from cover to cover as they approached the building. They were well-trained and disciplined, advancing with the kind of tactical coordination that suggested professional military experience. But they were also moving predictably, following the most obvious approach routes, and using cover in ways that made sense for conventional infantry tactics. For a sniper positioned at an unexpected angle, they were presenting clear targets. "I can interdict their approach," Sarah said, beginning to line up her first shot. "But I'm going to need covering fire and someone to watch my flanks." "You've got it," Williams said, positioning himself with his rifle to watch the southern approach to their position. "Rodriguez, can you still fight?" "I can shoot," Rodriguez replied grimly, checking his weapon despite his obvious pain. "These bastards hurt my friends. I'm not sitting this one out." Sarah's first target was the leader of the group approaching from the north. He was moving cautiously but confidently, apparently believing that the communications building's defenders were too pinned down to pose a threat. Through her scope, Sarah could see him clearly as he prepared to signal his team for the final assault. The shot was clean and precise. The enemy leader dropped, and immediately the coordination of his team began to deteriorate. The other fighters looked around in confusion, trying to figure out where the shot had come from while also dealing with defensive fire from the communications building. Her second shot eliminated the team's automatic weapons specialist, a man carrying what appeared to be a light machine gun. Without their heavy weapon, the attacking team lost much of their ability to suppress the building's defenders, allowing the American soldiers to return more effective fire. But the Eastern Assault Team was still advancing, and they were getting dangerously close to the communications building. Sarah shifted her aim to engage them, but they had spotted the muzzle flash from her previous shots and were beginning to lay down suppressing fire on her position. Bullets struck the armored vehicle she was using for cover, some of them punching through the metal and whining past her head. One round came so close that she could feel the air displacement as it passed her cheek. The enemy fighters were getting better at locating her position with each shot she fired. "We've got movement to the south," Williams called out. "Looks like they're trying to flank us." Sarah was now caught between multiple enemy forces. The group advancing on the communications building, the team trying to flank her position, and undoubtedly other fighters who would soon converge on the motor pool once they realized the sniper was operating from there. She was running out of time and options. Through her scope, she could see into the communications building where David was still at his post, speaking urgently into a radio handset while bullets shattered the windows around him. He was coordinating something important, probably the arrival of the reinforcements that represented everyone's only hope of survival. But he was also completely exposed to the enemy team that was now less than 50 meters from his building. Sarah made a decision that went against every principle of sniper tactics she had ever learned. Instead of staying concealed and picking off targets from a distance, she was going to move closer to the enemy. It would be more dangerous, but it would also allow her to engage multiple targets more quickly and accurately. "Cover me," she said to Williams and Rodriguez. "I'm going mobile." "That's suicide," Williams protested. "You'll be exposed to fire from every direction." "David's about to be overrun," Sarah replied, slinging her rifle across her back and drawing the sidearm that Williams had provided. "I'm not letting that happen." Before either man could stop her, Sarah was moving across the motor pool toward the communications building. She used vehicles and equipment for cover, advancing in short rushes while Williams and Rodriguez provided covering fire from their position. The enemy fighters spotted her movement almost immediately and began directing fire in her direction. But they were also taking fire from the communications building and from Williams and Rodriguez, creating a confused tactical situation where no one had a clear advantage. Sarah reached a position about 100 meters from the communications building, close enough to engage the attacking force with a rifle at point-blank range. But she was also close enough that they could see her clearly, and several enemy fighters were already moving to surround her position. Through the windows of the communications building, she could see David still working frantically at his radio equipment. Whatever he was coordinating was taking time that was rapidly running out as enemy forces closed in from multiple directions. Sarah took a deep breath, checked her ammunition one more time, and prepared for what she knew would be the most important shots of her life. The battle for forward operating base Granite was about to reach its climax, and everything would be decided in the next few minutes. In the distance, she could hear the sound that everyone had been waiting for, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors approaching from the south. The reinforcements were finally arriving, but whether they would get there in time to prevent a massacre remained to be seen. The woman who had climbed out of bed just hours ago as a visiting wife and mother was now crouched behind a military vehicle, rifle in hand, preparing to engage enemy forces at close range to save her husband's life. The transformation was complete, and there was no going back. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, but Sarah knew that the reinforcements were still several minutes away from being able to effectively engage the enemy forces. In those crucial minutes, everything would be decided. The attacking force seemed to sense this too, as their assault on the communications building intensified with desperate fury. Sarah positioned herself behind a damaged Humvee about 70 meters from David's building. Through her scope, she could see the enemy fighters preparing for their final push. They had regrouped despite her earlier interventions, and were now moving with the determination of men who knew this was their last chance to achieve their objectives before American reinforcements arrived in overwhelming force. The first target she engaged was an enemy fighter carrying what appeared to be an explosive device, probably intended to breach the communications building's reinforced door. The shot was clean, and the explosion that followed as the device detonated prematurely eliminated two other attackers and temporarily scattered the assault team. But more enemy fighters were approaching from the east, and Sarah could see that they had changed their tactics. Instead of moving in obvious groups, they were now advancing individually, using cover more effectively and making themselves much harder targets. These weren't untrained insurgents. These were experienced soldiers who had adapted to her presence and were now actively hunting her. "Sarah, you've got multiple targets moving on your position from the south," came Rodriguez's voice over the radio Williams had given her. "I count at least 4, maybe 5 fighters trying to flank you." Sarah divided her attention between the immediate threat to David's building and the enemy forces trying to surround her own position. She was now fighting a two-front battle with limited ammunition and no easy escape route. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Through the windows of the communications building, she could see David still working at his radio station, but now he had a rifle in one hand while operating the radio equipment with the other. The building's other defenders were firing from windows and doorways, but they were clearly running low on ammunition and were being steadily overwhelmed by the enemy assault. Sarah's next shot took out the lead fighter in the group approaching from the east, but his companions immediately took cover and began returning fire with disciplined accuracy. Bullets struck the Humvee around her, some of them punching completely through the vehicle's armor. Her position was becoming untenable, but moving would mean abandoning her ability to provide fire support for David's building. The helicopters were getting closer. She could now distinguish individual aircraft, at least 3 of them approaching from the south in a standard combat formation. But the enemy fighters could hear them too, and they were pressing their attack with even greater urgency. If they could achieve their objectives in the next few minutes, they might be able to withdraw into the mountains before the helicopters could effectively engage them. All units, this is Falcon 1, came a voice over the radio. "We have visual on the base and are beginning our attack run. All friendly forces take cover immediately." Sarah looked up to see the lead helicopter swooping low over the base, its door gunners already engaging enemy positions in the mountains. The sight of American air power arriving was the most beautiful thing she had seen all night, but she also knew that the helicopters couldn't engage targets too close to friendly positions without risking civilian casualties. The enemy force attacking the communications building was now close enough that the helicopters couldn't safely engage them. It was still up to Sarah to prevent David's position from being overrun in these final crucial minutes. She shifted her position slightly to get a better angle on the approaching fighters and immediately came under intense fire from multiple directions. The enemy had finally coordinated their efforts effectively, with some fighters engaging her position while others continued their assault on the communications building. Sarah's return fire was precise and deadly, but she was rapidly running out of ammunition. Each shot had a count, and there were too many targets for her to engage effectively. She eliminated 2 more enemy fighters, but others immediately took their places, and she could see that the assault on David's building was about to succeed. That was when Sergeant Williams and the wounded Rodriguez appeared at the edge of the motor pool, providing covering fire that allowed Sarah to reposition. Williams had gathered several other soldiers during their movement across the base, and they were now laying down suppressive fire on multiple enemy positions. "Move, move, move," Williams shouted over the gunfire. Sarah sprinted toward a new position closer to the communications building, her rifle ready to engage any targets that presented themselves. The helicopters overhead were now engaging enemy positions throughout the base perimeter, their heavy weapons systematically destroying the mortar positions and machine gun nests that had been supporting the assault. But the fight for the communications building was still being decided at close range, with individual soldiers and small groups engaged in deadly combat among the buildings and equipment of the base. Sarah reached a position where she could see directly into the ground floor of David's building, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Enemy fighters had breached the building's perimeter and were now fighting room to room with the American defenders. She could see David and 3 other soldiers barricaded behind overturned desks and filing cabinets, still trying to maintain radio contact with the helicopters while fighting for their lives. Sarah's final shots of the battle were the most important ones she had ever taken. From her position, she could see into the building clearly enough to engage the enemy fighters without risking friendly fire. Her first shot eliminated an enemy combatant who was about to throw a grenade into David's position. Her second took out a fighter who had flanked around behind the American defensive position. With only 2 rounds remaining, she carefully selected her final targets. Both shots found their marks, and suddenly, the immediate threat to the communications building was eliminated. The remaining enemy fighters, faced with accurate sniper fire from an unknown position and increasing pressure from the helicopter gunships, began withdrawing toward the mountains. "Falcon 1, this is Base Actual," came David's voice over the radio, clear and strong. "Enemy forces are withdrawing. Repeat, enemy forces are withdrawing from the base perimeter. We are secure." The sound of her husband's voice, calm and professional despite everything he had just endured, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. He was alive. They were all alive. The battle for forward operating Base Granite was over. As dawn broke over the mountains, the full scope of the night's events became clear. The attacking force had been larger and better organized than anyone had initially realized, with nearly 70 fighters participating in what had been intended as a complete destruction of the base. But the combination of determined resistance by the base's defenders, Sarah's sniper interventions, and the timely arrival of air support had turned a potential massacre into a decisive victory. The cost had been significant. 7 American soldiers had been killed, and more than 20 wounded, some seriously. But the alternative, had the base fallen, would have been far worse. The communications center that David had fought so hard to protect had indeed been crucial, coordinating not only the defense of the base, but also airstrikes on enemy positions throughout the region. As the sun climbed higher and medical helicopters began arriving to evacuate the wounded, Sarah found herself sitting on the steps of the communications building, still holding her rifle, watching the organized chaos of post-battle operations. Her hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline of combat giving way to emotional and physical exhaustion. "Sarah," David's voice was soft as he sat down beside her. He looked older than he had just 24 hours ago, aged by the night's events in ways that went beyond simple fatigue. "I heard what you did out there. Williams told me you probably saved all our lives." Sarah looked at her husband, this man she had married 10 years ago, and realized that they had both been changed forever by this night. She was no longer the civilian who had arrived to visit her deployed husband. He was no longer the communications specialist who had been looking forward to a quiet reunion with his wife. "I didn't want to fight again," she said quietly. "I thought I was done with all of this." "I know," David replied, taking her hand. "But when it mattered, you were exactly who you needed to be." Colonel Harrison approached them, his face serious but relieved. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said formally, "I want to personally thank you for your actions last night. Your intervention was crucial to our successful defense of this base." "I just did what I had to do," Sarah replied. "That's what heroes always say," the colonel said. "The Army will want to recognize your actions officially, of course. What you did last night will be studied in military academies for years to come." As the day progressed and the base returned to some semblance of normal operations, Sarah began to process what had happened. She had killed people during the night, had returned to a part of herself that she had tried to leave buried in the past. The clinical precision that had made her such an effective sniper had returned as if it had never left. But she had also saved lives. David's life, certainly, but also the lives of dozens of other soldiers who would have died if the base had fallen. Emma still had a father because of the choices her mother had made in the darkness of a mountain morning. 3 days later, as Sarah prepared to leave the base and return home to Colorado, she stood once again on the steps of the communications building. The bullet holes in the walls had been temporarily patched, and work crews were already rebuilding the damaged sections. But the building would always carry the scars of that night, just as she would. David joined her for a final goodbye. His deployment was ending early. The Army had decided that both he and Sarah had been through enough. They would be going home together, to Emma, to their quiet suburban life, to a future that would be shaped by the events of this night in ways they were only beginning to understand. "Do you think you'll ever be able to forget what happened here?" David asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. "I don't think I want to forget," she said finally. "What happened here was terrible, but it was also important. Sometimes good people have to do difficult things to protect the people they love." As their helicopter lifted off from forward operating Base Granite, Sarah looked down at the place where her life had changed forever. She was Emma's mother again, David's wife again, a woman planning to study nursing and build a peaceful civilian life. But she was also something else now, something she hadn't been when she arrived 3 days ago. She was a person who knew, with absolute certainty, that when everything was on the line, she could be counted on to do whatever was necessary. It was a burden she hadn't wanted, but it was also a strength she could carry into whatever challenges the future might bring. The mountains of Afghanistan fell away below them as they flew toward home, toward Emma, toward a life that would be forever marked by the night when a visiting wife became the hero of forward operating Base Granite. The woman who had come to visit her husband had indeed turned the tide of battle, but more importantly, she had discovered that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing to act in spite of it. In the years that followed, Sarah did complete her nursing degree and built the peaceful life she had planned. But she also became an advocate for military families, speaking at events, and sharing her story as an example of the hidden strengths that people discover in themselves during moments of crisis. The rifle skills that had once defined her military career became a part of her story, but not the whole story. And every year on the anniversary of the battle, she received messages from the soldiers who had been at forward operating Base Granite that night, thanking her for the choices she had made in the darkness when everything hung in the balance. Because sometimes the most important battles are fought not by those who chose to be warriors, but by those who chose to become warriors when there was no other choice.